So Optigan Allusion 1. Not only a piece of music I like a lot, but a terrible pun of a title, which we can take joint credit for, which is always a plus. Which is basically built feeding samples of a 70s proto-sampler instrument into a 90s digital live looper, and then messing with it with 2010s technology. So there's like...
It's like all kinds of layers of meta happening.
Yeah, like 60 decades worth of evolving looping technology and conceptual baggage attached to it.
Yeah. So shall we take a look?
We shall indeed. All right. So this was one of the very last things we did for the album.
Yeah.
We recorded this while we were actually, I think you had actually started mixing a lot of the stuff. And then this was like, I mean, all of the Optigan stuff was kind of an experiment, but this stuff of feeding the Optigan samples actually into the EDP was really an experiment. You know, because I don't think we had tried it and we had no idea what we were going to get out of it result-wise or what it was going to sound like.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, we had basically, at the point in time where we decided to work on the Optigan-based interludes, which on the record are Optigan Allusion 1, Optigan Allusion 2, you know, fancy names. I think at that point in time, we had finished all of the rest of the tracks. And, you know, when the project started, I was thinking that your EDP Echoplex loops would be sort of the, you know, the backbone of the project. And as we got into it and explored a few things, you know, there were a couple songs where we ended up just using Optigan material in that way that I had originally imagined the Echoplex throughout the record. Mm-hmm. So we have a couple songs, Champagne Music is one, Bossa Basic is the other, where the Optigan, you know, took the role that I had originally imagined the EDP playing throughout it. And, you know, on those ones, we tried to incorporate the Optigan and the EDP at the same time.
Right.
And I just thought it would be a nice touch to try to tie together the project and a fun experiment to take some Optigan-based material and in a totally guitar-free context, have you mangle them with your, you know, Echoplex looping, you know, sort of, well, Echoplex technique. I guess it's not exactly looping, but, you know.
It's looping?
Yeah, looping.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we actually, so we piped, do I remember correctly that you had, like, for each... You had like several tracks worth of loops and different instruments and different chords relating to the key center, like this is the 1 chord, the 4 chord, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think a lot of it was just you playing stuff and one or the other of us would say, okay, let's try this track. Let's try sending this element. Let's try that.
I mean, for people who don't know how the Optigan works, so, you know, it's basically, well, an optical organ, I think, is where the name comes from. And there's a keyboard where, you know, piano keyboard where you can play melodies like an organ or, you know, any, you know, those sorts of keyboard-based instruments. And then on the left side is a series of buttons that, you know, it's like an early sample triggering like device. I mean, it's not exactly triggering because the samples are playing on this disc that is constantly rotating.
So is that pretty much the same as like a vinyl record as far as how you get the sound out of it?
Now, I'm not an expert on it, but it's actually different from vinyl in that it's an optical reader.
Okay.
Which vinyl also plays in the groove, so, you know, you could start on the outside of the record, the first song, and then by the time you get to the end of the record, you know, you've brought yourself to this tiny little, you know, circle, and it's kind of rotating inwards. But the optical technology, which my understanding is how old film scores were presented, it allows the light beam, I believe, to stay in the same place, and then when you press the different buttons, it accesses different areas, you know, light areas, so that it just keeps rotating the disc, and the light remains the same. And depending on which keys, the actual piano style keys are also the sounds are coming off that rotating disc as well. But what's cool about it is, unlike vinyl, then, you know, where you have a sort of finite amount of time, between when beginning and the end of the record, and, when the stylus hits the end, it's done, With this, it just keeps rotating, which is to say it's not exactly like triggering in that it doesn't trigger from the beginning. It's just constantly rotating. So, they actually, I think, had a little light that would kind of show you where the beginning of the loop was supposed to be, and it would kind of blink.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, and kind of foreign now, So, basically, these accompaniment section is what we worked on, worked with. We didn't use organ's single notes. We took the, essentially what were primitive or early, maybe primitive is not the right word, but early, sample packs.
Right.
And
so basically like backing tracks
to accompany yourself on melodies, and you'd hit the one chord accompaniment, which would and each disc had a stylized theme to it. It would be the Dixieland pack, and then there would be the sort of Americana banjo pack. And so what we did is we just we took. Okay, well, a segue into just a quick discussion of something I think is really cool about your playing and your Echoplex uses. Most people, I think, when they're getting into looping, or certainly at least when I first started exploring looping, it was strictly as a means to layer, rhythmically or not, different things on top of each other and, be able to create a multifaceted, interesting, rhythmic or, non-rhythmic texture. But it was basically just layering things. Right. And with what you do, it really blew my mind the first time I saw you with your ability to, I guess, use replace functions and create these really dramatic moments, where you could expand or contract the length of your loop. You could just cut into the middle of a loop. There's all sorts of different things that your technique and style, allows you to create all these crazy moments if you want to, really dramatic kind of, I guess that's sort of the record kind of approach.
Thank you. A lot of that comes from the replace function in the Echoplex, which is the same as like punching in.
Right.
So
which is not traditional to the normal sort of just layering different layers on top of a loop.
Here's the really interesting thing. The more that I've done my homework on the history of live looping, the more I've realized that punching in and using a quote-unquote replace type function goes back to at least the late 60s with Terry Riley.
Okay.
Because when you listen to stuff like Rainbow and Curved Air or Poppy No Good and the Phantom Band, especially Poppy No Good, which is more of like, just kind of him doing a saxophone improv with tape looping. He's using a replace function. I don't think he was calling it a replace function. It sounds to me like he was using a punch-in feature on the recorders that he was using. But there are absolutely moments there in 1968 where he's getting these really hard edits. And yes, there are parts where he's building up these huge layers of polyphonic sounds. But there are also moments where it's a really hard edit. So it's kind of mind-blowing, to think that we're in 2018 and we're still like, you can still spend good money on a looper and not have it be able to do the shit that was being done in 1968 on a pair of reel-to-reel tape decks.
Right.
But yeah, using a hard cut, like overriding the material rather than building up layers is something I like a lot.
Yeah, and I thought just with how dense the Optigan loops are, they sound like full band recordings, that, if we set them up such that they were all tempo synced, more or less, so that, each, if we had some, loops from, some loops and some harmonic progressions that made some level of sense, we kind of had them set up and just playing continuously, and we could access different ones, where, Dixieland on the one chord, and then if you wanted to call out, banjos on the 6th chord, I just have them set up so we could do that. And I thought, with your ability to replace or however you wanted to approach it, you have a lot of tools at your disposal for what to do with these pretty dense loops to create some really interesting kind of seemingly jumping between different records almost, but still in time if you want it to be. And so that I think that was the genesis of this exploration.
Yeah. We should probably give a shout out to G4 Software for
definitely,
and apparently getting the original Optigan stuff tempo mixed and all synchronized so that it could be looped consistently by people like ourselves. I guess was kind of a technological challenge when they were first putting the library together.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Thanks, G-Force. The other thing that was kind of interesting about this is because of the way I had the UDP set up, I couldn't actually hear the stuff that I was cutting into the loop until the loop came back around. So it was kind of like, okay, I'll do a replace function here, but we couldn't actually hear how it would sound until the next time that the loop spun back around.
Oh, interesting.
So it was kind of flying blind in a way. It was kind of like, well, this might be a good place to do a punch in. And sometimes we got really happy surprises, and sometimes they were not so happy. And I guess the other thing that's worth pointing out, too, is that those, we would jam on that stuff for 5 or 10 minutes or more.
Totally.
So I would love to sit here and say that the stuff that we have on the final record was a single pass, unedited live virtuoso performance of improvisational acumen, but that's not the case, unfortunately.
No.
We whittled it down from like lots of noodling around and cutting and pasting and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think more or less what we did was we created what I think was a really captivating and, pretty unique and novel set of loops or, of samples, essentially sampling what you did. You recorded an early sampler instrument into your looping device, and then we recorded that and whatever you came up with, and then we, cut them. In this case, we're taking a look at Optigan Allusion 1. In this particular one, I think in my mind I was thinking like what to use a sort of simple, almost, I don't know, kind of. This one was one of the more dub King Tubby sounding of our pieces on this record, and it kind of has a little bit of a Jamaican flair to it. So with this one, I took what we created and found ways to make some 4 and 8 bar and sort of normal length sections into sort of a basic track.
Right.
And then, we did some little effect kind of stuff to those basic tracks, and you can see I had cut up some things here into 4 and 8 bar sections with, here, okay, so these are labeled declick, decrackle. I believe this is, Andre took some of the loops that we created, some of the stuff that he recorded, and just worked to make sure that the sort of glitchy sounds that can happen when you're using the Echoplex were at a tolerable level to you, Yeah,
we were getting a few different pops and clicks just from the audio sync, from having the Echoplex synced up to Logic for whatever reason. So that was just to get rid of those. And then I think the decrackle, I experimented with using Isotope RX to get rid of some of the vinyl noise. And I think we ended up keeping the vinyl noise just because it, that's kind of a big part of what the stuff sounds like.
Yeah, right.
I guess it's not literally vinyl noise if it came off of an Optigan.
Yeah, I think because the Optigans have a really kind of unique flavor to them, and I think there's it must have something to do with exactly how clear of a path the light has, So I think as things get dusty, it has and different things, they kind of have a certain. It's not the same sound as vinyl, but a similarly lo-fi and very delightful kind of throwback tone to it,
Yeah, it's so weird to me that, I mean, when new audio technology comes out, everybody is struggling to get it to sound as good as possible, but when people end up coveting old technology, it's almost always because of the limitations of it.
Right.
Whether it's a Mellotron or an Optigan or a lower resolution sampler from the 80s. I mean, a big part of why people like Fairlight and synclavier sounds is because it's not really super high quality. You've got a certain gradiness to the sample, or, now getting to the point where you can buy plugins that will emulate all kinds of analog gear or deliberately lower the sample rate or the bit depth to make it sound like older, not as refined digital gear. So the fact that, when you're making audio stuff, you're trying to get it to sound as good as possible, but people end up going back and using it for the limitations of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, because I find myself getting excited when I go someplace that has some sort of, uncommon piece of analog hardware or something like that.
Yeah.
And I do wonder, I was like, man, does a real plate just sound better? And that's why I get excited about it. And, if I had to choose between a plug-in version and the real thing, that I would choose the real thing every time. Mm-hmm. Or is it more just that it's like this really, distinct flavor that, when you do it with the real way, with the real piece of gear, and there's actual, stuff being recorded and you're not just, using a plug-in, if that imparts a certain amount of character that is just invaluable. I mean, I do think that is true, and I just can't tell if it's just such a kind of boutique flavor that I get really excited, and if I had to pick between the two, I would still actually use the plugins for more versatility.
It's interesting.
I don't really. Yeah, I keep going. I go back and forth, but
I also kind of feel like the process of creating this stuff is a lot of what's fun for people like ourselves.
Right.
So if it's more fun to actually run it through a hardware plate, then run it through the hardware plate.
Yeah, right.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
No, totally not. Yeah, I don't know what it is about some of those older technologies. I mean, I guess that being said, to go back to what I was saying, I just keep thinking about it because it's something it bothers me. It keeps me up at night, thinking about how I like these old things, But maybe it's true. They're just not, they are coveted, but they're not in demand enough that people seem to, that it warrants being in production anymore. They're in demand by people who really enjoy that flavor, but not to a degree that it's a commercially viable product like maybe it once was or was thought to be. I'm not sure. I don't really know. And I guess you do see people making Optigans now. There's a guy who has made I don't think it's commercially available. I'm forgetting his name, but he works for Quilter Labs. They make amps.
Right.
He's actually made one that's in production, and I guess people do, but not in production. But he made one and is considering putting it into production, which is really cool. And they are making Mellotrons, I believe, and somebody has started making plates on a commercially available level. So I don't know if they're kind of. I'm not sure. That's a long rabbit hole we just went down.
Quite all right. Much like the process of making music itself.
Yeah.
Let's hear some of this stuff.
Yeah.
So this is just 3 different tracks at the same time?
Okay, so for those who may be following along, let me break this down for 1 second. So I've tried to make these little pictures here be somewhat clear. So I'm calling these little records players here, I'm calling those are sort of our Optigan EDP mashups in their sort of, I don't know, I mean, I guess they have been mixed, but in their somewhat raw and unadulterated state, whereas these are some different effects that I recorded on them.
The ones with the sparkly icon.
Yeah, the sparkly icon. So you can see Decrackle CE300. So that's a chorus that I have, outboard chorus. Space Echo is the Space Echo. Multivox Spring Verb. Yeah, so these are just effects. So when you're watching that's kind of what will be happening. And they are pretty much effects of whatever you see above it.
Right.
So this is, for example, just the Space Echo of this file, and that's why they're kind of lined up as such. Well, let's give it a listen.
Yeah.
And if you listen clearly, what is cool is using the Echoplex like we did. To me, it sounds like a seamless groove of like a band playing to a degree. But if you listen on a really like intra-beat level, there's your vibes band, actually.
Yeah.
And then there's your horn band. You know, there's a couple different bands that are coming from a couple different Optigan sets, you know?
Yeah.
Sample sets.
So when you're doing this stuff, like, do you kind of pick a track and run it through some outboard hardware, and then, like, what's your process, like, figuring out where and how you want to use it?
You're talking about the effects?
For the outboard stuff, yeah, the hardware stuff.
Well, you know, the sound world that we had going on this record, I think was... I guess it is actually really varied. You know, there's a lot of different stuff going on. Instrument-wise and effect-wise. But I don't really... I was thinking of it as being extremely narrow. You know, yeah. I was thinking, you know, all right, we did use certain plugins here and there that could do all kinds of crazy stuff. But for the most part, I was thinking, well, here's, you know, 4 or 5 pieces of outboard gear that I felt like complemented the outboard effect gear, because we pretty much, with the exception of these Optigan samples, we pretty much, well, actually, I think we actually played everything else in besides the Optigan samples on the entire record.
Yeah.
So I, you know, thought that there was a couple things that I had around that I liked the sound of and that complemented the keyboards and guitar technologies that you and I had and played. So on a track like this, for example, I think it was something about this, like, little horn section.
Can we just solo that by itself?
Yeah.
So that's just the EDP with no effects?
There's a few just little mixing things.
Yeah.
There's but nothing drastic.
No hardware.
I even think this is just kind of making it a little gritty,
sure,
and lower fi. And I mostly use that particular plugin to distinguish it. I'm sort of thinking as alternating between sort of an A section and a B section, A section, B section. You know, sort of intro A, B, A, B, A, and then sort of fade out on the B section.
Yeah.
And that just was there to impart a slightly different character than the A section. But mostly, yeah, these plugins are not doing anything super transformative.
I kind of think of those as being kind of like the equivalent of Instagram filters for people who are maybe not so well versed with audio. It's just that when you listen to a lot of older audio recordings, the gear tended to be a lot less transparent and a lot more, it would color the signal in a more obvious way. And to me, Instagram filters, you know, are the closest analogy I can
that makes sense.
Of using it in a shorthand, you know, so more of a sepia tint or more of a grainy kind of picture. I'd say that's what a lot of these kinds of plugins are doing. They're basically, they're basically filling the role of what tape decks and analog consoles and preamps would have done if you were recording 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, I suppose I hadn't thought about it, but that's a great analogy. It's sort of an easy way to put it in a time and a place, you know.
Yeah.
And so talking about the outboard effects, I think just there was something about this that just felt 70s dub kind of pseudo reggae-ish, you know, feel to it, you know. And I think, you know, so I thought, all right, you know, Space Echo with, you know, if we listen to the two of those together.
Yeah.
In particular, after this trails off.
Yeah.
You know, just those kinds of effects. So, I mean, my process was simple, you know, in just that, you know, I think I use this chorus because the EDP is mono.
Mm-hmm.
So the chorus, I thought, you know, kind of helps. Not helps is not the right word, but
Well, anytime I record the EDP in a studio thing, I always, 9 times out of 10, I do something to stereoize the signal.
And actually, when I'm looking at it, it is bussed to this guy, which is a mono to stereo reverb. So it does give a certain stereo room feel that wasn't there. And then we add the chorus.
Yeah, that's something I do pretty much every time I'm mixing the EDP myself. So.
Yeah, so I guess it's pretty simple in that way, on this track. This guy, for example, is mostly just an effect for the intro, just to kind of highlight the climax of this.
Yeah.
I'll just boost it up real high. So that was kind of the process there. Nothing spectacular, just trying to complement what I felt was already there in the tune that we had put together. It's not really a tune. So the other bossa basic and champagne music I think of as songs. This is kind of just a groove. We could have put a melody to it, and I thought about it because I felt the material was strong. But I thought actually the basic sort of band track was engaging and exciting and interesting enough that I actually just wanted to leave that in focus and let it be cool, and then maybe highlight a few of the section changes. I guess that's another thing I could point out. A sections had the chorus effect going on. B section had this space echo going on. So using the effects just to help highlight a section, and then and just sort of orchestrate a little bit with effects, and that was kind of it.
And things like the crescendo at the very, very beginning, is that stuff you were doing manually on the controls for the space echo?
Let's see.
Were
sure
you doing
was.
like swells and stuff with the knobs by hand?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at it. I just for those who maybe don't use Logic, I just hit the automation button here, and there's no automation data there. There is some on this track, but yeah, so on this one that Andre's referring to, this big swell, yeah, that just sounds to me like I ramped up the feedback. And then cut it,
So that's actually just playing the knobs in real time as you're getting the stuff piped through.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, which is, I think, another thing I particularly, not that you can't do it with automation on hardware, on software plugins, but it's a nice part of that gear to play them like instruments.
Oh yeah, it's a very different feeling. I often feel like I would probably have a lot less interest in software if I didn't already play a really tactile instrument, like the guitar.
I mean, that and another reason that I first started getting into hardware was of course, probably like most people of my generation, I found out about a lot of the hardware through software emulations, and I would go to a studio, watch an engineer work or a player who had that gear, and I would see they would use them in certain specific ways that maybe, on the plugin, there may be infinite amounts of things you can do with them. There's so many parameters that are modifiable that I first got interested in hardware, but just kind of get a feel for what that gear was. If I was going to pull up a certain plugin all the time, well, maybe it's worth kind of experimenting with what the real version was.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that it helps kind of make certain decisions. If you're going to run something on the tracking part of the process through a compressor or something, well, that's you're limiting your options down the line, which, for somebody like me, that can actually be really helpful, because then I can start focusing on other things.
Oh, yeah. For me, too. I think everybody I know who does a lot of work in the digital domain has gone through at least one stage of just vanishing down the rabbit hole of infinite possibility and having to emerge out the other side. So,
and that's another thing I dig about that, part of it too is, if you're using effects, for example, maybe that doesn't always apply to EQs or compressors that readily, but with effects such as a delay, it's cool to be able to perform it like an instrument and add, that kind of nuanced, varied, unpredictable character that when you're, actually they're doing it in real time, and then there's also this tape going around that's kind of got his little quirks.
Oh, yeah.
It adds life to the project for a record like this, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Cool.
That's fairly expansive for a three tracks and 1.5 minute piece.
Well, I'm impressed. All right.
Awesome.
Nice.